Hi, this is Sewing Nut, Anna Sewing Nut, and today I'm going to attempt to show you how to set in a sleeve. And I think a lot of the issues with setting a sleeve in is not really understanding how it works in the first place. I mean, it is a bit fiddly, but if you understand how it all fits, then you've probably got a better chance of getting it in. So the first thing I'm going to do is to show you on a piece of paper how it all fits together. And talk to you also about where the seam line is and the seam allowances and which bits have to match up. So I'm going to attempt to change you to another camera, which is me going to have to look away and press a button. And then we'll see if I can show you easily what goes with what and how it fits together. Because I think once you understand that, doing it might be a bit easier for you. So let's see if I can switch cameras. So here is my overhead cam, such as it is. I just, a little bit of shuffling, I have to shuffle my chair up to get to it. So what you can see I've got here is I've got a sleeve piece, and the camera is it's quite tricky to get it all in. Let's do it that way around. It doesn't quite put it all in, does it? It's a sleeve piece. There we go. And on the sleeve, I've put the markings from the pattern, which are a single notch here, which donates the front of the sleeve, double notches here, which donate the back of the sleeve. I've got 3 dots here. These show you where the seam line is, which is on this pattern 5/8 away from the edge. And they also give you some points to match up with on the bodice piece to keep you on track. So that's the shoulder seam, the one in the middle, and we'll see in a minute on the bodice there's also a couple of dots to match up. Now what's really, really important is that you think about where the seam line is. Don't worry too much about the edges of the pattern. So when a pattern is made, the seam line is where it joins up with another pattern piece, and the seam allowance is just there so that you can physically join it, or else there's nothing to sew to. And it is put at 5/8 traditionally around the edge, but that doesn't mean that the edge will match up with the edge of the other piece. It means that the seam lines will match up. If you think about a circle, I've got a circle here and something to draw on. So here's a circle. Okay, if I've got a circle in my pattern, there's my circle. If I draw around it, then can you see it just about? Yeah. So that circle that I've drawn is my seam line. But the circle piece itself will have to have a seam allowance on it. And then the bit that it fits into will also have to have a seam allowance on it, but in the other direction. So this is my circle piece with a seam allowance on to make it bigger than a circle, because it's got to stitch into something. And if you think of this now as a whole, then and this part as my garment, this part is my garment, then it has to have a seam allowance in here to make this piece of fabric bigger so that they can sew together. So what you've got here now is one seam allowance edge of fabric, which is enormous, one edge of fabric which is tiny, but in both cases the seam allowance where you're actually going to sew, the seam line, sorry, not the seam allowance, the seam line is the same on both. And although an armhole isn't an exact circle, that's the theory we're working on. So if I try and match this edge of fabric with this edge of fabric while I'm sewing it together, I'm soon going to get into trouble, aren't I? So on the sleeve piece, this is where I'm stitching. This is the bit of extra seam allowance that's been put on that's made it possible. On my pattern piece, this is where I'm stitching. and this is the extra that's been put on to make it possible. So we're not expecting the edge of this fabric and the edge of this fabric to be the same size, but we are expecting, to some extent, for the seam line on each to be the same size. And that's the first aspect. So if I have a look at the way this fits, I've marked the seam lines on here. So this will be where your sleeve is attached to itself. So you will sew it together like that, and this bit will effectively be removed from the equation. And on the back piece here, move it into shot, this is the seam line down here, and effectively that bit's removed from the equation because it's attached to the front bodice. So I've marked that with a cross there. So that's going to be the available fabric where you start your seam line, and this here as well. And if I put those together, you can see that it looks like they don't fit because they're a different shape, but actually they are, to the notch, exactly the same size. So what you need to do when you're sewing it in is you need to know where that seam line is, and you need to match it up. So if you watch me with the pencil here, this is what you'll be doing when you sew. So I'm lining up the seam lines so that they're on top of each other, and the minute that they start to diverge from each other, so up to here, it's kind of okay. Now we're going off a little bit. So I'm going to put my needle down, lift my foot up and pivot this, and go again until about here, and go again until about here. And can you see that my seam line on the sleeve is matching up with the seam line on the bodice underneath? And when I get to here, look, the notches, they match up. If I tried to match the edge of this fabric, I would have got myself in a terrible mess, because they're not the same size, but the stitch line is the same size. So we got to here. To carry on, let's see what happens. So I'm thinking, right, if I keep going, this dot here relates to this dot here. There's several for different sizes. I marked the one that's for this size. So if I keep going, lining up my seam line, and as soon as they don't match anymore, put your needle down, lift your foot and rearrange. Now what you'll find here is that, ta-da, doesn't match. Look, there's the, can you see the orange one underneath? And this one on top. Now this doesn't match. And that's because in the sleeve head, which is the section between the notches, there is some extra fabric. That's the ease. And this is so when you put your sleeve in the shoulder, it's got some sort of space for you to move and some space for the shoulder, because unlike the flat circle example, your arm is not a flat circle from the armhole, so it needs to create a kind of sort of slightly curved shape. So in order to do that, they've put extra fabric in here. And in the instructions, it says, do some stitching and ease up between the notches. So what I've done, and I'll show the actual thing in a minute, is I've put some stitches in here, gathering stitches, and some stitches in here. So I've put one set either side of the stitch line. And what happens is you gather it up slightly, and then this seam line will be the same size as the one you're trying to stitch into, just like down here, but the fabric will be looser, if you like. I'll show you it for real in a minute. So what will happen then, once this is sort of gathered up a little bit, is that as you sew it down, these dots will match. That's what they're there for, to help you get the ease evenly distributed. And again here, once you've gone round with this eased up, this will match the shoulder seam. And you can see that it doesn't at the moment. It's just going out of shot, isn't it? So those dots are to help you, because that's quite a long distance from here to here. That's quite a long distance to get even gathers. And actually it may be cut so that there's a bit more give in one place than the other. So those dots will help you to get it in the right place. If I do this on the front as well, so that's the back part. The front, it works in exactly the same way, just so that you can see it again with a slight variation really. So this here is where it will start, because that bit is caught in the seam. And again on here, that's where it will start, because this bit's caught in the seam. And I'm putting the crosses on top of one another. And I'm going to stitch along, because first of all, it all matches all beautifully, and then it starts to diverge. And as soon as you see it not matching, you need to put your needle down and move it around. And we've got another one about there. And there we go. And now the notches match, and after the notch it's going off on quite a swerve. And you can see as I turn it round, it looks like the notches don't match. So that's sometimes the problem, is you try and match these notches up and they do match, but if you haven't done this pivoting along the way, you might match them up incorrectly. So they're there to help you along the way, not necessarily to fix at the start. Okay, and again, if we carry on this side and go towards the blob, you can see again here the orange blob. Let me see, if I can push that down, you can see it a bit better. So the orange circle here is a little bit further back than the one on the sleeve, because it needs easing slightly. Okay, so now I'm going to show you on an actual sleeve, and I've done part of it, and I'm hoping that it isn't going to take me huge amounts of time to do the bits I want to show you. So this is my inset sleeve. I've got right sides together. I've got the sleeve on the inside of the bodice. I'm trying to get this into a place where it shows well. Let's move these that way for a moment. Sorry. Okay, so this is the bottom, and you can see my bodice seam and my sleeve seam. They're matching together and are pinned. Then I've got a pin here and a pin here, and these are the notches at the bottom of the sleeve. So these are the bits that, even though they don't really look like it at the moment, because the edges don't really match well, those are the bits that, if you know where your seam line is, and you'll see I've drawn it on actually, I mean, you could tack it through or draw it on. So I've got, you can just about see it. The camera's making this fabric look like it's stripy or something, and it isn't. So I've got seam line drawn on there. Can you see it? Just about. And I've also got the seam line drawn on in there. And as I go, I mean, I might pin it or tack it, to be perfectly honest. I'm going to make sure that those two line up like I showed you with the pencil on the paper. So that'll be those bits. And they should fit exactly, we know they fit exactly, you've just seen it happen on paper. The other pins I've got in here, I've got this one, which is the shoulder seam. You can just see the shoulder seam there. So that's the shoulder seam pin. And these two pins, this one and this one, are the dots that we had on the sleeve. Try and get the sleeve back under here. So though you can see the dots at the top there, those are those three pins, that's the shoulder seam. Now if you look inside there, you can see that it's bumpy, for want of a better description. Can you see all the bumps? Yeah, and that's because that area of the sleeve is slightly bigger than the outside of the sleeve, and what it asks you to do in the pattern is to gather that section up. And in order to help me do that, I've put some gathering stitches in. Can you see? Here's the 2 rows of stitching. So what I'm going to try and do, if it takes too long, I shall pause and come back, is pull these so that it gathers the sleeve up to help you get these 2 seam lines together. So you can see it get already here, look, that you can just about see the yellow seam line. It's strobing a lot. There's a seam line drawn in here, if you can see it a bit better, and there's a seam line drawn on the other side, and I'm planning to match them up. And can you tell what's going on there? So it's hard to tell, isn't it? It's a little bit bumpy, but not as massively bumpy as it was before. Let me see if I can see how quickly I can get this to gather in nicely. I've got a little bit from either end. If you pull it all from one end, basically what happens is you get loads of gathers here and nothing around the other side. So as I'm pulling it, I am trying to move the fabric along a little. I've got as far as the centre line here, and I've still got a bit of a bump, so I'm going to pull it a little bit more. And I mean, if you've got something like a puffed sleeve, then these will be quite gathered. And that's okay, because you want gathers on a puffed sleeve, but this one doesn't want to have too many gathers. It just wants to be pulled in slightly. So I'm playing around here and trying to even out that pull so that when it attaches to the seam line on the other side, it's really hard to show you, there's not loads of puckers. It's just slightly looser on this side than that side. Don't worry about the gathers here, because as we know, this is longer than this. Remember the circle demo? So this is going to be longer. We're only interested in the seam line, which is slightly longer because they wanted to give you some room, but nothing like as long as this. So that's reasonably flat in there now. Can you see? Will it focus? So that's reasonably flat in there now. Whereas around the other side, I've still got quite a few big bumps and a lot of stuff that isn't really, so hard to show you, fitting. So I'm going to do the same. Here's my stitches the other side, look. I'm going to pull on this and gather it in a little. If I could do it too far and show you what happens if you go too far. Yeah, so this one's pulled really tight now, and I've got some really ugly looking gathers, puckers. Can you imagine sewing over that now? It looks dreadful where I'm sitting. I can't, if I bring it closer, does it help? Yeah, you can see now some really sort of ugly puckers there. And actually, if I look on the outside, I've also got extra fabric on the outside now, which is definitely not what I wanted. I wanted to make the inside fit the outside, so I've gathered that up too much. So just pull it out a little bit. And the outside is flat, and the inside is slightly, just very slightly gathered. And what I'm really concentrating on is where that seam line is on both sides to make it as flat as possible. A little area in here which needs a bit of attention, so I'm going to pull this a little bit more. What's it looking like on the screen there? Don't want to make you feel seasick. There we go. And what I've got now is I've got fairly flat but slightly sort of looser arrangements inside than I've got on the outside, but the outside is quite flat. And when I come to stitch it, I'll be doing the same thing as before. I will be stitching a few stitches, checking that my seam lines are in the right place, maybe putting the needle down and pivoting. I mean, what I would normally do now, to be perfectly honest, is tack this, and I'm not a great one for doing extra bits and preparation, and you know, I'm a bit of a let's get it done kind of individual, but if I tack this now, it helps to keep it all in place. And it really, because you're hand sewing and you're close up to it, you can really find the seam line, and you can really see where your gathers are good or bad. Now I've got a little situation here, having looked at it now. Go to the camera, which way? I want to show you, there's the backwardsness of camera. I go that way, no, that way, and I've got a really bad, actually you can see it there, I've got a really bad pucker just here, so I need to sort that out, and I'm going to sort it out by trying to assess where that fullness should go. So I've got my pin in, which is keeping it all nice and flat here, so it's clearly belongs in this section here, between these two pins, and you can see that it's quite flat down this end, and it's got a lovely little pucker just there. So I'm going to ease that pucker out by just moving those gathers along a little bit. See, it didn't take much, that was a very gentle touch, and now it's not puckered, and the seam line here is flat against the seam line the other side. There's a bit of a question about which way to put it through the sewing machine, and I tend to assess the situation as I go as to which is the more of a bother. If I think I'm going to get lots of puckers because it's gathered a lot, you know, it might be a full sleeve or puff sleeve, I would probably sew with the gathers on the top so that I can see what's going on. If it's eased like this, and I've tacked it and I'm fairly certain that it's going to be a reasonably good job, I might sew it from the other side, because the feed dogs actually help to take in that gathering a little bit. They the bottom feed dogs move the fabric very slightly quicker than the fabric on the top, and so if you need to take in fullness, having the feed dogs on the bottom can really help. I think you need to try it and see which you prefer. So I would normally stitch this section. So I'm going to stitch this section first from there to there, and actually, you know, quite often I lock it off there and deal with this section separately. And again, this side, there to there, remembering to pivot and, you know, moving around, remembering not to try and match these edges up. It's the seam line that needs to be matched up. So somehow or other, you've got to know where that is. And I usually draw it on. When I do my own patterns, I tend to draft without the seam allowance. So when I'm cutting things out, I draw around the pattern shape, which is effectively here. And then I add the seam allowance on as I cut it out. And so I've always got that line drawn for me. But if you're using a commercial pattern, you somehow need to find a way. You can tack it on, you can measure it in a few places, you can draw it on. Tracing wheel and carbon paper could be a way. Some patterns have it marked. The multi-size patterns, sadly, tend to leave you and to do it yourself. And actually with this one, I did get a tape measure every little and put the dots in, and the fact that it's a dotted line is mainly because I put the tape measure along and measured it in. So that can be a bit of a faff, but actually you really need to know where that seam line is. I can't tell you that enough, because it's matching the seam lines which is going to get you a nice smooth sleeve. I guess you might want to see the end result. I might have to, I haven't got the sewing machine set up in here. I might tack it in. I'm not going to do that live. I'll tack it in and show you what the result is. That might be an idea, mightn't it? So I'm going to go away for this way. Look, I'm going to go away for a little while. You see how lovely and smooth that is in there now, instead of those great big sort of bumps that we had before. I'm going to tack that in and come back and show you the result. Now we've got the big reveal before the battery runs out on the equipment. The one's already gone on the overhead camera, so there we go. So what I've done is I've tacked this. I don't know if you can how well you can see it. I've tacked it in blue. It's quite dark, isn't it? Tacking stitches perhaps a little more obvious inside. No, can't see them at all. I did it in blue so that you could see it. Can you see the blue on the red dot there? No, not at all. Okay, that's rubbish then. If I do that, can you see at all? You just about catch that one there. So I've tacked it in between the two rows of stitching. And actually I didn't need to pull this bottom one in a little bit, but if my gathers had been a bit tricky, I could have used the bottom one as well to help me pull it in. Oh, well, you'll see in a minute that I must have stitched it because I'm going to do the big reveal. It's just not showing at all, is it? Nice blue stitching for you as well. Okay, anyway, I'm going to pull the pins out. One day I'll have this whole video thing sorted, but still very much in the experimental stage. I've had a new laptop, which is one step further than before, so I'm not bending over the table leaning over a tiny phone now. But anyway, stitching, can you see stitching? You can see stitching or not. Anyway, let's turn it the right way out and we'll see what's happened. Oh, look, beautiful. Beautiful. Hopefully you can see how beautiful that is at least. Beautiful set-in sleeve. Can you see how it's got some shape to it? And that's the gathering at the top that gives it that beautiful shape. And the stitches you can see are the second line of gathering stitches. So they will be pulled out. They were just there to help me gather it. There aren't any puckers in it. It's just nicely gathered there. If I could see, turn it that way. The overhead camera was better, wasn't it? Focus on that. Maybe if I put it a bit further out, it might actually be easier to see. Can you see there's just sort of little gathering around that spot? I might take some photos, put them up after so you can see better. And then I would take this out because it was just tacking stitches to help me gather. On the inside, what you've now got is seams. Oh, I hate this. Yeah, you see the seams. It's quite a big seam allowance, and what I would do is I would trim that down. In fact, I might even double stitch. I'd trim that down after I'd stitched it and send it towards the sleeve that way. So you send it down towards the sleeve. It gives an extra bit of support for the shaping at the top here, and is the most comfortable when you're wearing it. So I'd chop it down and send it through. This camera is really not very good, is it? See, I can see it really well. I'm quite pleased with myself. I've done quite a good job. I can't show it to you. Is that any better? I think you can just sort of see there that it's got a nice gather into the sleeve head. It's not focusing very well, is it? Okay, I might try and get some better shots of that, maybe just photographs, add some stills for you at the end if I can work out how to do that. So there you go, that's setting in the sleeve, and I hope that now fully understanding the ins and outs of what fits where and what you're aiming for, hopefully you'll have more joy with it. It is definitely part of the garment that's worth taking time over, and really finding where that seam line is and marking it in, and really being, you know, ultra careful about that will give you the best results. I know it's a bit boring, and it's quite tedious, and the gathering, you know, you can't be bothered, can not be bothered, but it's definitely worth it, because actually if you have to pull it out because you've got tucks in it and go again, then it's going to take longer in the long run, isn't it? And your fabric's never quite the same once you've pulled it out. So if you've got any questions, pop them on the forum. I'll try and answer them for you. And what I'm also going to do is try and put some photographs up there so that you can see the finished result better than I've been able to show you now. So I hope that's helpful. See you next time.